of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
No ceasefire ever goes without a little bit of choppiness. What we have been very clear about is that we want to stop the bombing. We want our allies to stop the bombing, and we want the Iranians to do the same thing. We're seeing evidence that things are going in the right direction, but it's going to take a little time.
Tonight, a fragile ceasefire. Less than a day in, Iran says its temporary peace plan with the U.S. has been violated, but talks are still on. The vice president will head to Islamabad this weekend with special envoys Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff to meet with Iranian leadership. And wave of optimism. Traders shrugged off fears the ceasefire could unravel in today's session. Stocks rebounded alongside the biggest plunge in oil in 6 years. But the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz remains in jeopardy as Israel continues to launch strikes in Lebanon. We'll have more with Israel's ambassador to the UN this hour. Plus, transatlantic tensions. The administration is reportedly weighing a plan to punish NATO countries they deemed unhelpful during the war with Iran. News coming as the NATO chief, Mark Rutte, visits with the president at the White House. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons. We begin this evening at the White House, which earlier today called the ceasefire with Iran fragile, even as the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, praised it.
This is a victory for the United States of America that the president and our incredible military made happen. Thanks to the unbelievable capabilities of America's war fighters, the United States has achieved and exceeded those core military objectives in just 38 days. Iran has agreed to open the Strait of Hormuz, and as the president said, we have received a proposal from the Iranians that has been determined to be a workable basis on which to negotiate.
But the Speaker of Iran's parliament says the ceasefire has already been violated, with Israel repeatedly striking Lebanon, hitting civilian and Hezbollah targets in Beirut, putting the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz in jeopardy, though the Trump administration maintains it expects that to happen immediately. Joining me now with the latest from the White House is Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan, who's live on the North Lawn. So, Kate, at this hour, where exactly do things stand? Is the ceasefire intact?
The ceasefire remains very fragile as attacks continue across the region, including in Lebanon, where Israeli strikes have now hit very busy commercial and residential areas in central Beirut. Just hours after the ceasefire was announced last night, the White House says that Lebanon was not part of the ceasefire agreement, that it's still intact. JD Vance, and they're touting, they're projecting optimism about these talks as JD Vance heads to Islamabad on Saturday to lead these negotiations. It's the highest level meeting between the U.S. and Iran, not just since the war has started, but in decades. It's a very notable, it's a very notable next step in this process. The Strait of Hormuz is, of course, a very big issue front and center here. My colleague Jeff Mason asked White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt about this in the press briefing today. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
What role does the president see for the U.S. in monitoring or helping with the Strait of Hormuz going forward?
I think the president commented on that this morning. We're going to continue to monitor it very, very closely. We will be helpful in any way that we can, but we fully expect Iran to do this, and the president has made that quite clear as well. It's, again, as his statement said last night, this ceasefire is subject to the safe reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Again, this was just determined last night. We understand things take time, but that's the president's expectation, and he will hold everyone to it.
So the White House there really reiterating this idea that this fragile ceasefire is very much dependent on the Strait of Hormuz being reopened. And there are a lot of questions right now about who exactly is controlling the strait.
Indeed, there are. I also have a lot of questions as to what exactly is happening in the White House behind you, Kate, as the Secretary General Mark Rutte was scheduled to meet with the president. Press obviously were not invited into the room. Do we have any visibility as to how that conversation went or is going?
Not currently. It is very notable that reporters were not invited into the Oval. It doesn't happen all the time, but the president likes to invite reporters in to do questions and answers, not for this meeting. And it comes as the president has really been ratcheting up his rhetoric against NATO and member allies. He's been complaining a lot about what he says is a lack of willingness to participate in the U.S. military campaign, in Iran. He has a lot to say about that. And the White House press secretary, just hours before Rutte got to the White House, delivered a message from the podium saying that Trump believed NATO was tested and they failed during the Iran war. So, we have not gotten an official readout yet of the meeting. We don't have reporters in there right now, so we're just waiting to see what comes out of this meeting on a potentially very important day for the NATO alliance.
All right, Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan reporting live from the White House North Lawn. Thank you so much. Now, when it comes to the U.S. and Iran ceasefire, tenuous as it may be, financial markets took the news of it today and ran with it. Stocks surging, oil plunging by the most since 2020. For the details, we turn now to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, who's joining us live from World Headquarters in New York. Nora, run us through it.
Well, a big relief rally that we're seeing on Wall Street today, Kaylee, that is, of course, on optimism that the worst part of the conflict in the Middle East is over. So you did see Wall Street really taking that and running with it. Of course, a lot of people trading off of that 2-week, of course, truce that we are seeing between the U.S. and Iran. That really buoying stocks higher. We saw stocks hitting their highest levels since March. We saw more than 400 stocks to the upside in the S&P 500. The S&P 500 higher by about 2.5% to end the trading day. Also, the tech-heavy NASDAQ 100 and Dow Jones Industrial Average both higher by about 2.9%. We saw industrial stocks really paving the way in the S&P 500. Industry, no surprise, the worst performing group in the S&P 500. Our team over on equities on the print side talking about this being the biggest short squeeze that we've seen since 2020. So clearly a lot of optimism filtering into the market here. Taking a look at oil, we are seeing oil lower, though. I mean, of course, a lot of people really factoring in what this means for oil markets, of course, really calming some of the ideas and the fears behind the idea of an energy shock. So we are taking a look at oil. We see Brent crude right now down double digits alongside WTI as well. So really keeping that in focus. Also been having my eye on both Bitcoin and the U.S. dollar. We are currently seeing Bitcoin lower a bit. Well, it's now a little bit higher, so it's really wavering between gains and losses. But we do still see it topping that $70,000 handle. So continuing to see people trading there. And also back to that U.S. dollar, also keeping an eye on that, down by about 0.8% right now, Kaylee.
Well, Nora, as you focused on the oil prices specifically, it's one thing for crude prices to be down. It's another for us to see all of the products that crude is turned into go down, whether it's prices at the pump or even the price of jet fuel. I know we got a warning on that from Delta today, a $2 billion hit on fuel costs through the end of this quarter. What else did we learn from them?
Well, this is the first major airline to report earnings, so we kind of see Delta as the bellwether in this scenario. They are talking about a $2 billion hit in terms of fuel costs, and so we're really thinking about how airlines are grappling with this time, given the spike in fuel costs, whether or not they're actually able to deal with that internally or put that on the consumer. In this case, it does seem as though this is going to be filtered into some of the fees potentially for baggages. We've been hearing from Delta saying that that would be the case alongside some of their other peers. So really keeping an eye here, but Delta still saying the fact that they see their premium customer really being a great cushion in this moment. So we'll have to see how this really trickles out for some of those more cost-conscious airlines.
All right, Bloomberg's Nora Melinda in New York. Thank you so much. Now, of course, what happens with jet fuel, with energy prices across the board, is going to be dictated by how this ceasefire or this conflict moves forward. So joining me now for more on that is Holly Dagres, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and also author of the Substack, The Iranist. Holly, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. As I said at the beginning of the program, Iran, at least the Speaker of Iran's parliament, says the U.S. already has violated this ceasefire. How do you interpret the messaging we are getting from the Iranian side as the U.S. says, no, this is intact? The president expects that the Strait of Hormuz is going to reopen, and we are sending a high-level delegation to Islamabad this weekend.
Well, first, thank you for having me on the program. I think it's noteworthy that the Iranians are saying that the ceasefire is being violated by Israel, but the Iranians are also violating the ceasefire. They've attacked the neighbors again. They've also attacked Israel. So I think it's people are pointing fingers at each other, but it seems all parties involved, with the exception of the U.S. itself, have been actually violating the ceasefire. And so I think when we talk about the ceasefire itself, I think the most trustworthy person to look at this in this moment is the Prime Minister of Pakistan and what they're saying. And I think it's noteworthy that in the initial announcement, he had said the ceasefire included Lebanon, and now we're hearing it's the complete opposite.
Yeah, he did, and he said it applied as well to U.S. allies. You would think Israel was included in that. But I want to go back to your point, Holly, about Iran having also violated the ceasefire, that it not just being a question of what Israel and the United States are doing. It speaks to the idea of Iranian credibility here. This is actually something I got into with the former commander of Central Command, General Frank McKenzie, earlier today. This is what he told me.
The hard part is ahead of us. Look, the Iranians are not great fighters. They've never been great fighters. They're brilliant negotiators, and they know how to negotiate. They grew up in a culture that is based on negotiation. They will now seek to draw negotiations out, change the terms, and create a new reality. And that's our task now will be to take the substantive operational victory which we have obtained and turn it into something lasting and strategic.
I wonder if you agree with that assessment, Holly, and if this is the beginning stages of Iran trying to draw this out beyond even just a 2-week timeline.
I don't think that the general was wrong there. I think they do have a history of doing that. But I think the difference here is that this is a temporary 2-week ceasefire, and it's a temporary pause. And I think that the sword of Damocles is still hanging over the Islamic Republic. And so I think that's what makes the situation different than just saying the nuclear talks, where there was a long-term threat of war potentially in the horizon, but not so near in the moment that we're seeing right now. So I think that they've got a lot to lose, but I also understand from their standpoint, the Islamic Republic thinks that now it has some real tools in its toolkit. And the key one is that it's able to close the Strait of Hormuz. And I think that's what they're relying on. And the fact that they've been able to survive as a regime, and that's why they're declaring victory in this moment.
Well, so on that, Holly, the idea that even the administration has acknowledged that right now, if vessels want to transit the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran says is not happening because of the Israeli strikes in Lebanon, that it would need to be done in coordination with Iran's armed forces. And when the White House press secretary was asked about the idea of Iran charging tolls, she said, yes, the president wouldn't like to see that. He wants to see the free flow of transit. But even their ability to consider that, does that not underscore that Iran is actually emerging from this in potentially a much stronger position, at least when it comes to the strait and the kind of economic levers it can pull than it had even before this conflict began?
Absolutely. And the reality is that we know one of the big critiques of the original Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, that the first Trump administration withdrew from in 2018 was that they allegedly they did get bags full of cash on a plane. And so here we're actually giving them money now. We've had this temporary sanctions lifted on oil at sea. And now we're saying, oh, well, they can treat the Strait of Hormuz like a toll booth. And so what are they going to do with that money, some of which, according to reports, will be in crypto, is that they will be rebuilding their ballistic missiles program, and they will be trying to rebuild whatever defense capabilities they have in the future, so to protect themselves from a future conflict. So I don't see them in a strength of weakness. Yes, the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed on the first day of the war. Yes, some of the top military brass were killed, but the fact of the matter is that much of the clerical establishment is still functioning and in place, including its 3 branches, the presidency, judiciary, legislative branch. And so I think they are really in a position of strength to an extent.
Well, and as we talk about all of these individuals and the regime structure that remains in place, Holly, clearly what the president called for on day one of this, for the Iranian people to rise up and to take the country back, that did not materialize. And I wonder if we consider the Iranian population, the tens of millions of them, knowing that the president suggested he was going to kill the entire civilization, even if there are some who say we shouldn't take those words literally. I would imagine that rung very differently in Iran. How should we consider that domestic consideration, what the Iranian people have gone through, and how it may color their opinion, frankly, of the United States?
I think that the language that the president used was really problematic. And while there is an internet shutdown that's been imposed for 40 days now, they are in tune with every moment, every news item through diaspora satellite channels. And so they were very acutely aware. And the little bit of information that was petering out at the country was people that were in fear. They didn't know what to expect. They didn't know if their power was going to be permanently cut off. I had Iranian Americans that had families in Iran contact me and ask of a nuclear weapon was going to be dropped on Iran, which the White House said wasn't going to be the case. But going back to your original point, yes, there was a promise of help on the way after an unprecedented massacre in January, and that's why the military assets were moved to the region to begin with. And then for the expectation for Iranians to rise up when there's still a heavy security presence on the streets, when there's executions happening, and there's been arrest of at least 1,500 ordinary Iranians, ethnic and religious minorities, it's kind of hard in this moment to feel that you can rise up when you're feeling the pressure from the clerical establishment's security apparatus, and then the pressure from an American president that seems to be changing the goalpost about what he's trying to do with this Iran war that was happening.
Well, and Holly, just quickly, it's obviously not just about what the U.S. wants to do, but Israel as well. Does Israel have reason to believe this new regime, if we're calling it new, in Iran will be friendlier, less threatening to it now?
Well, from the looks of it, it's still the same Islamic Republic, and it's still making the same death to America, death to Israel chants in the streets in their pro-regime rallies, even when they had the ceasefire declared yesterday. So I don't think it's going to be a different Islamic Republic.
All right, we have to leave it there. Holly, thank you so much for joining us. Holly Dagres, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute. Coming up, oil plunging the most in 6 years today, even as the Strait of Hormuz remains largely blocked. We'll discuss what's next for the Middle East energy sector with Leslie Palti-Guzman of CSIS next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Iran doesn't have the same ability to defend it the way they did before. And so, as the president has pointed out to the rest of the world, we barely get any of our energy out of the Strait, just a tiny fraction. It's time for the rest of the world to step up and ensure that that stays open after President Trump and the War Department brought Iran to the place where they are voluntarily opening it right now, as was announced last night.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lines. And that was Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth earlier today discussing the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, which still remains largely blocked, at least at this hour. And joining me now for more on the impact on the energy sector is Leslie Palti-Guzman, founder of the strategic advisory firm Energy Vista. She's also non-resident senior associate with the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at CSIS. Leslie, thank you for being here. It remains very unclear, I think, to a lot of us what exactly the situation is in the Strait of Hormuz right now, whether or not vessels are able to transit it safely. Amid this uncertainty, is there a real effort happening to get any kind of energy product through at this time, or is it still a wait-and-watch approach?
Thank you, Kelly, for having me. And I think it's all about the Strait of Hormuz right now. Many market participants are wondering what a full reopening can mean, or is it going to be a limited reopening and still Iran filtering through the transits? Specifically for LNG tankers, for instance, Qatar tried over the weekend to pass two cargoes and rerouted and turn around because it's unclear what happened. But it seems that right now, even with the ceasefire, the market, we've seen gas prices, for example, LNG prices drop today, which means that the market is anticipating a reopening of the strait. But politically speaking, on the ground, militarily speaking, we're still waiting to see what it means.
Well, so what are you looking for in terms of next paths, or next steps, rather, to gauge whether or not energy is going to start flowing? And at what rate do you expect? Can we return to the pre-war normal, if you will, in terms of how much is able to get through each and every day?
So if we focus specifically on Qatar, for instance, which is one of the world's largest LNG exporter, they used to export, I believe, 2 to 3 cargo a day, 80 to 90 cargoes a month. And they will need the security guarantees, but also the technical ability to export as much to be able to fully restart their liquefaction trains. Right now, not only their fields are shut down, but also their liquefaction facilities, and they have a number of trains. So they will have to get this certainty to be able to restart all their trains. Otherwise, they will keep them shut down until they are fully certain that they can pass at least 2 to 3 cargoes a day.
Well, Leslie, that's a really important point that you're making. I feel like a lot of us have focused just specifically on the strait reopening and exports getting out, but the production shut-ins we have to consider on the oil side, obviously, but also on the LNG side or something else. When we know that Qatar itself has warned with some of the infrastructure that has been hit, it could take production capacity, at least a portion of it, offline for a extended period of time. What kind of timelines realistically are you looking at for Qatar or for other any other producers in the Gulf states, frankly, to get back to where we were? How long does it take to ramp that production back up?
So for me, in my analysis, I count at least 3 months of Qatari LNG production out, which is, and in addition to that, we got 2 liquefaction trains out of service because of the missile attacks. So it's about 30 million tons of LNG out of the market for 2026. Now, some of the 80% of Ras Laffan could still restart in the coming weeks if, again, they have the certainty that they can have a safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz.
So when we consider the markets where this product is going to, as President Trump has repeatedly said throughout the course of this conflict, the U.S. doesn't need it, that really this is about Asian countries and European countries as well. I wonder if you're expecting for those receiving markets of this product for their behavior to change. If you take Europe, for example, which already was burned at the start of the war between Russia and Ukraine, having to find other ways in which to get its energy, having largely cut off Russian oil and natural gas, turning to the Middle East and producers like Qatar, now having, of course, this situation with the Strait of Hormuz. Is there somewhere else that these countries might be able to turn if they are concerned they aren't going to be able to rely on Middle Eastern energy supplies in the same way that they hoped?
You're raising a very good question, because the issue right now is trust for the consumers and the buyers. And as long as they perceive a threat hanging over the head of the Gulf countries, they will not be reassured that in the future there won't be any more war or strikes. And if Iran and the IRGC are able to reconstitute some of their stockpiles of missiles, or are trying to do something with the uranium that is buried, there will be, again, in and off some strikes in the region. And that's unacceptable for the Gulf countries, but also for the consumers of those products. So for Europe, for instance, I think the least and the last resort will go back to Russia, but there are some alternatives. I mean, the US LNG, for example, is still the second largest supplier to Europe right now. We've seen that a German company signed a contract with Argentina recently. And then, some people are going to look more closely at sub-Saharan Africa, maybe Alaska, and other parts of the world. But it will be like small pockets of supply, because the 2 largest exporters that had that have vast plans for expansion are Qatar and the US.
All right, Leslie, so appreciate you joining us. Leslie Palti-Guzman, non-resident senior associate with the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at CSIS, and also the founder of Energy Vista, a strategic advisory firm at our world headquarters in New York. Thank you so much for joining us. And as we were just discussing with Leslie, much for the energy sector, for the global economy, for geopolitics overall, is going to depend on the fate of the Strait of Hormuz and whether or not the reopening that the U.S. says it is expecting actually happens. Iran, of course, is saying that vessels still cannot translate so long as Israel continues to strike Lebanon. Iran actually saying the U.S. must choose between a ceasefire or Israel continuing this war. We'll have more with Danny Danon, Israeli ambassador to the UN, next, right here on Bloomberg.
The valiant efforts of all of our incredible service members created maximum leverage for the President of the United States, allowing he and his leadership team to engage in tough negotiations over the past couple of weeks that have now created an opening for a diplomatic solution in long-term peace in the Middle East. The president's maximum pressure and the leverage created by the success of Operation Epic Fury led to the Iranian regime asking for and ultimately agreeing to a ceasefire proposal with the United States.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lines, and that was White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt earlier today on the ceasefire between Iran and the U.S., which, of course, Iran says has already been violated. Joining me now for more here in our Washington bureau is Bloomberg's Nancy Cook. Nancy, we also heard Caroline Leavitt today characterizing Iran as having been the one that backed down here, not President Trump. But the president has been saying for weeks that he was hoping for a deal. Did he not want desperately for a way out of this conflict?
Yeah, I think that they were really looking for a way to de-escalate it, and particularly yesterday. And I think that a bunch of people in the White House have been frustrated by the high gas prices. They're very nervous about that with the midterms. They're very nervous about just what is not getting done domestically because everyone is so focused on the war in Iran, and all of his top officials have been focused on it. And, I think that there's just concerns that his MAGA base and just Republican voters are not excited about this. And so I think that there was a real sense in the White House of relief yesterday when, he announced, no one knew exactly what he was going to do when he announced that there was this 2-week ceasefire deal. Of course, today what we've seen is that the devil is really in the details. Mm-hmm. The Strait of Hormuz is still not open. Oil is not flowing from the region like we necessarily thought it would. And so there's still a ton of details to be worked out.
Well, and as you talk about kind of the MAGA base, at least part of it, who was not satisfied with this course of action, those who were buying more into the America First ideology, more of an isolationist bent, that in theory would have included, at least previously, Vice President J.D. Vance, who was very vocally against interventionism in the Middle East specifically, and obviously had to support the president in this in large part. What should we make of the notion that it's now J.D. Vance who is going to be leading the delegation in Islamabad this weekend for these negotiations?
Well, I think that's the White House trying to put him in a good position for 2028 when he will run for president. And by saying, leaking or sort of giving hints. I think his people have been giving hints about that he wasn't necessarily for the war, but he wanted to be a good soldier and go along with the president. And now trying to give him the opportunity to be the one that will bring it home or sort of close up the negotiations for the America First base. I think that they're trying to position him so that he has a good answer ahead of the 2028 presidential run on how he handled the war in Iran.
Should we read into that as Vance over Rubio right now is the thinking of President Trump?
I've been thinking about that a lot. I mean, I think Trump likes both of them, and I think Rubio's stock has been riding very high in the Trump White House. And also, he's a Florida person. The Trump White House is run by Florida people. But I've been sort of I've been wondering the same question.
We'll probably have to wonder that for a few more years, as 2028 is still a bit away. Bloomberg's Nancy Cook, thank you so much. Now, speaking of Vice President J.D. Vance, while traveling in Hungary earlier today, he discussed Israel's role in the current ceasefire. Take a listen.
The Israelis, as I understand it, again, I'm supposed to get a fuller report when I get on the plane, have actually offered to be, frankly, to check themselves a little bit in Lebanon because they want to make sure that our negotiation is successful. That's not because that is part of the ceasefire. I think that's the Israelis trying to set us up for success, and we'll, of course, see how that unfolds in the next few days.
So that's how the vice president characterized things, but this is how Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu characterized things in televised comments today.
We have more objectives to complete, and we will achieve them either through agreement or by resuming the fighting, because we're prepared to return to combat at any moment necessary. The finger is on the trigger.
So joining us now with more insight into Israel's thinking amid this ceasefire is Danon, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. As you just heard, the vice president said Israel is willing to check itself in Lebanon. Is that the case?
Thank you for having me again, Kaylee. It's very clear from the word of President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu that Lebanon, more specifically Hezbollah, is not part of the agreement, and we will continue to make sure that they will not pose a threat to Israel. We did not decide to attack Hezbollah. They decided to attack us, and they will not dictate when to end this cycle of violence. We will continue to dismantle their capabilities and to make sure that they are not posing a threat to Israel anymore.
Well, I wonder, Ambassador, how far Israel is willing to go to achieve that aim. President Trump, of course, yesterday suggested he was willing to eradicate the entire Iranian civilization in the name of achieving his objectives. How far is Israel willing to go in Lebanon?
So we have nothing against the Lebanese people. We have no beef with Lebanon. Actually, we welcome the comments of the leadership of Lebanon saying that they want to get rid of Hezbollah and they want to get rid of the rule of Iran in Lebanon. But unfortunately, Kelly, they are just talking. They are not capable of doing much. So we are basically implementing the policy of the Lebanese government. You know, when you speak about sovereignty for Lebanon, we are helping the Lebanese government to gain sovereignty, because unfortunately they are not capable of pushing Hezbollah out. And you know, we have been in Lebanon for years, for decades, dealing with Hezbollah, and every time same discussions, same agreements, but at the end of the day, they don't want or they cannot do anything against Hezbollah. And you know, only November 24, we signed a ceasefire agreement with Lebanon about southern Lebanon, and look where we are today. Hezbollah is back next to our border, launching rockets into our communities.
Well, so in the name of targeting Hezbollah and trying to get that situation in Lebanon to change and trying to enable, I think what you're saying, the Lebanese government to wrest back control, is potentially disrupting the ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran worth it to achieve that aim? Is that all right by Israel?
Well, I beg to differ about the notion of disrupting the ceasefire. You know, the ceasefire
well,
was about...
Iran is saying that, Ambassador.
Well, it was not part of the agreement. You know, it's clear. Maybe now they are trying to improve the agreement. But, you know, that's the Iranians. They always play games. They always lie and tricks. But we know that the main issue is not Israel in this cycle. The main issue is Lebanon, Iran. And you know, maybe they lost a lot of assets in Iran today, and they are fighting to keep control over Lebanon. But if we speak about stability in the region for the future, we have to start to speak about Lebanon without Iran.
Well, I'm wondering, Ambassador, where exactly wires were crossed here, because the Prime Minister of Pakistan, who, of course, served as a mediator here and initially had requested this 2-week period, said in his statement yesterday that he was announcing the U.S., along with their allies, which I would assume is inclusive of Israel, have agreed to an immediate ceasefire everywhere, including Lebanon. So did he misspeak?
Well, I don't want to speak on behalf of anyone else, but like you quoted the Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump, they said it very clearly that Lebanon was not part of it, and it shouldn't be part of it, because, you know, Iran looks at Lebanon as a proxy, that they dictate what's happening there. It's not the case. Lebanon is a sovereign country, and we have to deal with that independently. So with all due respect to the request of the Iranian, they cannot dictate what's happening today in Lebanon. They are trying to do that.
Well, Ambassador, obviously, a U.S. delegation, at the very least, is going to have the opportunity to speak directly with the Iranians in Islamabad this weekend, is our understanding. Is Israel going to have a seat at that table? Will you also be sending a delegation? No,
we will not participate, but, you know, we trust the United States. You know, we appreciate the support of President Trump. He proven his leadership on this issue of Iran, not only in the last 40 days. You know, during his first term, he pulled out from the JCPOA, and in the last 40 days, he showed he's not only talking. And today, Iran is not in the same position they were 40 days ago. And we actually, I say we, it's Israel and the US, we prevented Iran from obtaining a nuclear power. You know, and we look at North Korea, and without the actions of the US and Israel, Iran would have been in the same situation of North Korea. We prevented that scenario, and we are grateful for President Trump. And I'm sure that he will know to insist on the important issues in the negotiations, which basically is not allowing to become a nuclear superpower, you know, reducing the ballistic missile capabilities, and making sure they are not using their proxies to terrorize the region.
Well, on the subject of the nuclear program specifically, from Israel's perspective, is guaranteeing Iran cannot develop a nuclear weapon. Can anything guarantee that short of making sure that there is no more enriched uranium in Iranian territory? Do you think Iran is prepared to agree to that?
Well, first of all, I hope that the Iranian, you know, they received the memo. We mean business. When we said we will not allow them to move forward, we mean it. And they just saw in the last 40 days our capabilities. And, you know, it includes the enriched uranium, the ballistic warheads, the research. You know, when you build a peaceful reactor, you don't have to hide it in a mountain. You don't have to enrich uranium to that level. You know, we saw all the signs. That's why we took action. And I think they should know better. You know, we are not stupid. You know, the world today, we have the technology, we have the intelligence. We know exactly what's happening on the ground in Iran. They should know that when they enter the negotiating room, they cannot continue to lie anymore.
Well, and as you speak, Ambassador, of Israel having this technology, having the intelligence, having the ability to continue, frankly, to strike Iran if you deem it necessary, are you willing to rule out doing that in the future, even if the U.S. makes an agreement in that same vein? Will you agree to whatever it is that President Trump signs on to?
Well, we always said that, you know, our security is first priority, and we will do whatever is necessary to protect our people. But today we are in a different scenario. Today, together with the U.S., we pushed the Iranian program back. So we don't have like a threat today like we had 40 days ago. But in the future, if you ask, if God forbid we will be in a situation that we will feel that the act of the Iranian regime is threatening our security, we will do whatever is necessary.
Well, on the subject of the regime, Ambassador, President Trump argues that this is a new regime. He calls it more reasonable. He suggested they're more pragmatic. Is that also Israel's view of the new leadership? Do they no longer pose a threat to the state of Israel in the same way that they did?
Well, in terms of the personalities, President Trump is absolutely right. You know, it's an entire new generation. In terms of the ideology, I think it's too early to call. We have to wait and see where they take the nation. And I hope there will be a new regime. You know, we all pray and hope for a new regime change. And it still can happen. You know, it's very hard to predict a revolution, but once it happens very fast. So I still hope it will happen sooner than later. The Iranian people deserve a better regime.
So is it still Israel's hope, then, that there could be even more change to the regime than we have already seen?
Absolutely. You know, I speak with many Iranians that are outside of Iran, inside Iran. You know, they suffer there from this regime. So I hope something will happen. You know, many people want to know when and how, but we have to wait. It's for the Iranian people to decide about it. Today, the regime is a weak regime. We saw that. You know, we took so many capabilities and assets from this regime. And I hope that the time will come sooner than later that the people of Iran will build a new generation with new leadership.
And finally, Ambassador, when we consider the notion of a new regime or the Iranian people rising up, if we could get to that point, the U.S. has called for that as well. President Trump has said the Iranian people should come and get their or take the opportunity to take their country back. He suggested help is on the way, but the president obviously now is signaling that he is hoping to pull out of this conflict if a negotiated settlement can be reached. So just definitively, before we end the interview, when President Trump declares, if he does so, that this war is now over, does that necessarily mean it will also be over for Israel?
When we started this operation together, we coordinated everything, we fought together, and we will conclude this operation together. And we trust President Trump to insist on the core issues regarding the threats coming from Iran. You know, you look at the map, the distance between Tehran and Tel Aviv, you ask yourself why they have this hostility against Israel, why they develop those ballistic missiles against us. It's pure hate, pure ideology. We will make sure that Iran will not pose a threat anymore to Israel and to the region.
All right, Ambassador, thank you for being so generous with your time this evening. Danny Danon, and Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And coming up, we'll continue our conversation on the state of the ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran. Of course, Israel's role in it as well, when we assemble our political panel up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
I'm announcing that today the Senate will vote next week on the War Powers Resolution. Congress must reassert its authority, especially at this dangerous moment. No president, Democrat or Republican, should take this country to war alone. Not now, not ever.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons, and that was Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer earlier today, saying he expects a vote on a war powers resolution for Iran in the Senate next week. Those comments coming even as we're in the middle, supposedly, of a ceasefire deal between the U.S. and Iran, though there's conflicting statements in that regard. And joining me now for more is our political panel, Roger Fisk, Democratic strategist and former aide to President Biden, alongside Republican strategist Greta Joynes, policy director at Brownstein Hyatt Farber Schreck. Welcome to you both. Roger, as the Democrat here, I just wonder what the point is really of doing this now if we're in the middle of a ceasefire, assuming that it holds.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you're seeing is there's an appetite on my side of the aisle for what Democrats are doing to fight back, and there's even kind of a name being given to them, which is the Fight Back Democrats. And I think anyone, obviously in safe seats, but even on some marginal purple districts, is going to want to be in that camp. And I think the vote that they're asking for, as well as the noise that you're hearing about the 25th Amendment, is that's the kind of stuff that a minority party can do in terms of putting a line in the sand and trying to make some rhetorical hay out of this. Because as we all know, in terms of parliamentarianism within either chamber, there's not a lot that the minority party can do.
Well, and when we consider the role of Congress here, a war powers resolution obviously could be vetoed by the president. These kind of efforts have been unsuccessful thus far. There was no vote to authorize what the president has done in Iran. And even in the absence of that vote, Senator Lindsey Graham, who, of course, has been one of the biggest cheerleaders of this effort with Iran, now says he thinks the Senate needs to review whatever agreement ultimately is come to between the U.S. and Iran. So we need to vote on that, but not the war starting in the first place, Greta?
Well, I think that the president certainly has looked at what is happening in Iran, what has happened, and frankly, where we were about to go. And there was imminent action that he believed that needed to be taken. Obviously, Iran has been proven to have lied about what they were capable of, what sort of weapons they had, and what they were intending to do with them. We now know that they had weapons that could have reached Europe. They have certainly been targeting a number of our allies and will continue to do so in the future. I think what Senator Graham is certainly hoping to get a better understanding is of how can we ensure that this doesn't happen in the future, and how is any agreement that we go into going to prevent any sort of additional action being required down the road. The president has clearly stated that he wants this to be a short engagement. And I think making sure that we are dotting the I's and crossing the T's on any ceasefire is important to that.
Well, to your point on he saw where this was going, isn't that somewhere that he was leading us, Greta? The Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez, who, of course, has had quite a rift with President Trump over this conflict in particular, so we should note that as we consider his comments. But he effectively said he's not going to celebrate someone who started a fire now bringing a bucket of water. What do you say to the notion of the idea that the president first played arsonist and now is trying to play firefighter?
I mean, it's a little nonsensical to me. I don't understand how you can look at the Iranian actions over the past 20 years and say, we picked a fight with Iran. Clearly, they have been targeting the U.S. in both, various support of various terrorist groups around the world. They have been enriching uranium and gaining, using a lot of money to ultimately procure weapons and then lied about what they were doing. So, I think Spain certainly has a position on many different things that President Trump is doing. I do not think they're going to be coming to a state dinner anytime soon.
I would doubt that.
But I do think that, the president has been very clear and I think outlined, I think, as anyone who's worked in politics for a while, you know where Iran has been and certainly where this regime intended to go.
Well, and on that notion that we've seen a pattern with Iran that they have lied before, Roger, why should the president take it at face value that Iran means it this time when it says it has no nuclear ambitions, that no, that's not what we're doing here? Can it be believable? How do you guarantee that, as they tried to do or at least control in the Obama administration?
You never do, which is why it's bizarre that the president at least categorically signed off on the 10 points, one of which is that the IAEA would get out of Iran's business entirely. There's a logical arc to all this, which is it would make sense that we end up in something that's very difficult to understand, with Pakistan saying that Lebanon is part of the ceasefire and then the U.S. saying it's not, and Israel bombing Lebanon, which is... This all started in basically we're going to start a war to prevent a war that's not really a war, but it's been a war for 47 years. When you start with that as the foundation, it's very difficult to really build something that has a sound, logical narrative focus to it, which is why, for example, the entire foundation of the entire thing is if the president was right a year ago saying that we obliterated their capacity, none of this would be happening. So there's an appetite to mislead on both sides of this because the president said their capacity was gone last year. And if that was true, what have we been doing for the last 6 weeks?
Okay, so there may be some serious trust issues that are at play when people gather in Islamabad this weekend, when the U.S. and Iran sit down for mediated talks in Pakistan. That's a delegation that's going to be led on the U.S. side, Greta, by the vice president. Sure. How do you consider the role of J.D. Vance here, as we understand that he was one of the more skeptical voices inside the administration on all of this?
I think that he'll be a welcome voice to come into this. I think in particular, given the work that Steve Witkoff and, the other folks that have been doing the sort of pre-negotiation prior to the in-person meetings, I think that being a skeptic of the value of this, I think brings an additional ability for him to maybe take the tone down a little bit in the face-to-face negotiations. And I think ultimately that will be helpful to the president to have that additional perspective going into these conversations.
And finally, before we go, I want to note the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has now left the White House after meeting with President Trump, after the president has been openly very critical of NATO for not providing more support to the U.S. in these operations in the Middle East. The White House press secretary today, Roger, would not rule out the president trying to withdraw from NATO. What would that mean, even if he can't do that, because Congress would have to have
a say? Right, it brings us back to your first question.
Even if he were to try.
Clearly, his appetite is he's much more comfortable with the authoritarians of the world. And I don't know why he stiff-arms kind of the Western democracies in the way that he does, and also why he doesn't understand why they're not trying to assist in the Strait of Hormuz when they weren't consulted at all before this, just like the president didn't speak directly to the American people about why we were getting involved in this as well. So it would require an act of Congress. I think what he can do is what he's essentially been doing since 2016, which is kind of quietly quitting, right? You just care less, you show up less. If the G7 lasts 2 days, you go for one. You send a lower level delegation to some of the working groups and et cetera. And I think, so in a sense, he might not say it, but his actions are definitely creating more distance with NATO.
All right, we have to leave it there. Roger Fisk, Greta joins our political panel this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, for more coverage, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online, and come right back here to Balance of Power tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.